Okay, so when you have this situation, you have two lines cut by a transversal, but those two lines are parallel. They're not just two random lines going in any direction. They are actually parallel lines here, which we see by those little shaded in arrow markings on the lines. It means those angle relationships we had, the corresponding angles, the alternate interior angles, the alternate exterior angles, and the consecutive interior angles, there are certain things that we can say about those angles. Some of those angles become congruent, some of those angles become supplementary. So we're going to learn which is which so that we can work out some problems and find some missing angles whenever we have this situation of two parallel lines cut by a transversal. So down below here, you're going to make a table that is a 2 by 2, just like we did last time. Give yourself lots of space. So when we have two parallel lines, corresponding angles are going to be something. Alternate interior angles are also going to be something. Alternate exterior angles are going to be something. And consecutive interior angles are going to be something. And we're going to draw in what these are all going to look like. So when you have two lines that are parallel, and they have to be parallel, that are cut by a transversal, every set of corresponding angles that you have that are in those matching locations, they are all going to be congruent. And remember, this is your congruent symbol right here. And we'll draw that in a moment. Your alternate interior angles, they are also going to be congruent. She might just use that congruent symbol there. Your alternate exterior angles are going to be congruent. You can just use that congruent symbol there. And they might seem like they're all going to be congruent, but they're not. Consecutive interior angles, they're the ones that are different. They are not going to be congruent just because you have parallel lines. They are going to be supplementary. Which means they will add up to 180 degrees. They're the ones that are very different. Okay, so we're going to draw sets of parallel lines cut by transversals, and I'm going to draw the parallel lines going in different directions because I don't want you to think they always have to be horizontal. They don't. So I could give you parallel lines that are a little slanted like this, cut by a transversal, and I show that they are parallel with those shaded in arrow markings. Sometimes I might use one set of those shaded in arrows, sometimes I might use two of them. As long as it's the same number on both lines, that's how I know they're parallel. So here's line M, line N, and the transversal P. Do another set over here. Line M, line N, and the transversal P.
Did you ever like this or no?
Okay, and then do a couple more. Make sure you label every line with its name. And make sure you label the parallel lines. And then you want to go in and number all of the angles. So now that we have all of those angles numbered, we learned corresponding angles were in matching locations like 1 and 5, 2 and 6, 3 and 7, 4 and 8. Now what we can do is take what we know are called corresponding angles and we can give them all congruent markings. So angle 1 is congruent to angle 5. Angle 2 is congruent to angle 6. Angle 3 is congruent to angle 7, and angle 4 is congruent to angle 8. And if it helps, you can always color code these two to see it visually. 1 and 5 are corresponding angles. They're congruent because you have parallel lines. 2 and 6 are corresponding angles, and they're congruent because you have parallel lines. 3 and 7 are corresponding angles, and they're congruent because you have parallel lines. 4 and 8 are corresponding angles, and they're congruent because you have parallel lines. Okay, so alternate interior angles, they were on alternating sides of your transversal, and they're interior to your lines or inside your lines. So I go inside my lines and I say, okay, which ones were alternating? That'd be 4 and 5, and it would be 3 and 6. So they're congruent. So angle 4 is congruent to angle 5, and angle 3 is congruent to angle 6. And I can also go in and color code that to make it visually a little easier to see. Angle 4 is congruent to angle 5. Angle 3 is congruent to angle 6. Those are my alternate interior angles. They're only congruent when I have parallel lines. If my lines are not parallel, I could not assume that. Then my alternate exterior angles, they're congruent. So alternating sides of the transversal. Exterior means exterior to my two lines or outside my two lines. So I'm going to cover up the interior spot here So they're on alternating sides of this transversal, and they're on the outside or exterior. So that'd be 2 and 7, 1 and 8, and they're congruent. So angle 2 is congruent to angle 7, and angle 1 is congruent to angle 8. And again, if it's easier to visually see that, I can color code those. Angle 2 is congruent to angle 7. Angle 1 is congruent to angle 8, because those are your sets of alternate exterior angles. And you have parallel lines. If my lines were not parallel, I could not call these congruent. All of these so far have been congruent, but consecutive interior angles are not. They're the ones that are different. They're supplementary, meaning their measures add to 180. They're not the same. So I look here and I say my consecutive interior angles, they are interior to my two lines. So I'm only looking at 3, 4, 5, and 6. And consecutive means one right after the other. So 3 and 5 are consecutive. 4 and 6 are consecutive. They're one right after the other. They're not split apart or separated by anything. And they're supplementary. So if I want to show that angle 3 and angle 5 are supplementary, I say the measure of angle 3 plus the measure of angle 5 equals 180 degrees. And if I want to say 4 and 6 are supplementary, then I say the measure of angle 4 plus the measure of angle 6 equals 180 degrees. And then I have my two sets of consecutive interior angles that I am showing are supplementary. So 3 here, 5 here, 4 here, 6 here. They add up to 180 degrees. They're not congruent. Just remember that anytime you want to talk about angle measures like this, you can only know that they're either congruent in one of these three or supplementary here if lines are parallel. If you don't have those parallel markings, you can't do any of this. You can name them and say these are called corresponding or alternate interior, alternate exterior, consecutive interior. And you can give them that name because that name is still there whether they're parallel lines or not. But you only can say this about the angle measures if the lines are parallel.